Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome to the studio, Max Mishkin. He is a partner at the law firm of Ballard and Spahr in the media law group, and also does excellent work helping out MDDC's pro bono legal hotline. So welcome to the program, Max.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yes, it is always fun to talk to you, except we're not really talking about fun subjects today. What I wanted to bring you on the program to talk about is some of the press freedoms that are being eroded at the federal level and how that affects not only the journalists at a local level, but the public at a local level. And so let's run down what's going on and why and how press freedoms are being eroded.
Sure.
So
I
take it
think
away.
there's a parenting book, a famous parenting book that's it's all joy and no fun. I think the life of a media lawyer right now is it's not all joy and no fun is close. I mean, all important and no fun might be closer to it. But yes, it's not fun. You're right, but it is an interesting set of challenges that journalists and media lawyers like me are facing right now.
Absolutely. And they're so critical. So in just the space that we're recording this at the sort of midpoint of January, we've had an FBI raid on Washington Post reporter's home, Hannah Natanson. We've had Stars and Stripes getting a memo through social media saying that they're not going to cover quote unquote woke issues any longer and not understanding what that means. We have diminishment of press access at the Pentagon. We've got diminishment and straight out kicking out reporters from the White House press pool. And all these things are maybe could be construed as like, oh, that's just a Washington issue. That's just a federal issue. But I wanted to ask you first, did I get everything on your bingo card about what's been going on? And second, let's talk about what that means, sort of not only for the federal level, but a little bit deeper.
Sure. Well, two answers. The first is not quite all the items on the bingo card, unfortunately. There's even more. The other is just the caveat that I'll probably give a couple of times throughout, which is to say, like, Ballard represents the Associated Press in litigation related to one of the issues you talked about, the White House press corps. So I'll just caveat that I'm speaking today. The opinions expressed are my own. I'm not, speaking on behalf of any clients. And I'm not going to talk specifics about any of the matters that Ballard is working on. But with that said, so a couple other issues that I would sort of put towards the top of the list. There's the defunding of public media.
And how could I forget? Sorry, that it's hard to keep everything in one's head. Yes.
Certainly, a long dreamed of priority that has come to fruition, or somewhat come to fruition. And the further erosion of FOIA, and FOIA has never been great, but especially under DOJ, there has been significantly greater cutbacks in FOIA as a tool for news gathering. So I would add those to the hopper of challenges that the press is facing right now.
So, and of course, we haven't even gotten into like the economic challenges and sort of just challenges of existing in 2026 and being a business in 2026, because we could add, tariffs to that. We could add labor issues across the board. But in terms of these sort of these press issues, let's contextualize that, because each and every one of those sort of half dozen instances or situations that we talked about could really rock the foundations of the free press. But when you put all those pieces together in a landscape, what does that really mean? Is there, you know, not necessarily a strategy, could be a strategy behind that, or but what's the net effect of what's happening as all these pieces are lining up?
Well, I think if you believe, as I do, that the press serves a really important structural role in our democracy of ensuring that we have informed voters, people who are understanding how the government works, how their courts work, that the challenges to the press are challenges to the public, and that it's impossible to talk about these things as hurting the press without talking about how they're hurting the public at large. And I think that's sort of the connecting tissue is what do all these things do? Well, I think that they mean a less informed or a less reliably informed public. I think that across the board, you talk about restrictions on access to government facilities, whether you're talking about the Pentagon or the White House. You're making it harder for journalists to do their job, which is to report the news, some of the most important stories from some of the most important decision makers in the federal government. Um, if it's harder for them to report, then the public knows less about what's going on in the White House or in the Pentagon. And if you are uh, you know, uh, reducing or eliminating funding for public media, you're making it harder for people to get news and entertainment. But I think mostly about the effect on news, especially for people in communities where public media is an invaluable resource. I have the luxury here, and we in the greater DC area have plenty of news sources. We can read and subscribe to. Um, but there are plenty of places around the country where public media is. I mean, it's a one-stop shop for everything from news to emergency alerts, right? So
Right. Right.
that hurts the public. I think that you've got um, you know cuts to FOIA, and closing FOIA offices or consolidating FOIA offices makes it harder for the public to understand what agency officials are doing, the reasons that agencies are making the decisions they're making. All that is just it's an information shortage, and it makes it harder to be an informed member of the public.
Absolutely. And I want to sort of step back for a moment because when we look at FOIA laws, when we look at some of the access issues that we're talking about, the press kind of writ large doesn't have specialized access. I mean, obviously getting into the Pentagon, you have to be a credentialed reporter and things like that. But under FOIA, journalists don't have any special rights or privileges. They are professional users of FOIA, and in Maryland, it's the Public Information Act and local access to information programs. But the public can request information just as readily. So, can you talk a little bit about how the press or journalists stand in for the public? And if in are there areas where journalists really have significantly different rights than the public?
Yeah, so I mean what you've hit on is sort of a tension in the law. There's this notion that, I mean, start with the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech or of the press or and of the press. Um, for a long time now, there has been an academic debate about whether the press clause in the First Amendment provides any protection to the press separate and apart from what you're already getting from the speech clause. There's it is the subject of academic writing and thinking, but largely the trend in courts has been, well, if you're dealing with First Amendment issues, generally speaking, you might think of the press as a representative of the public, but
Mhm.
journalists don't have, the First Amendment doesn't grant greater rights to journalists than it grants to ordinary members of the public who are not working for professional news organizations. But that's just the First Amendment. That is, FOIA is actually one of the places where the institutional press does get treated differently than ordinary citizen requesters in a couple of ways. One is if you're seeking expedited treatment, expedited
Mhm.
processing of your records. Another is if you're seeking a fee waiver, either for search fees or copying fees. And then if you are forced to litigate a FOIA request and you win, and then you can seek your attorney fees. It is, the case law is pretty good for journalists. So it's not to say you have to be a journalist in order to get your fees, but being a journalist and having it sort of on its face, the fact that you sought these requests to inform the public really strengthens your ability to seek an award of attorney's fees at the end of the rainbow. So FOIA, in several ways, treats journalists or can treat journalists differently. And the other thing that we talked about that you mentioned is searching of journalists' homes. So there is in fact a federal law, the Privacy Protection Act, which was passed in response to a Supreme Court decision about the search of a Stanford newspaper, the Searcher v. Stanford Daily, that specifically provides greater protection for journalists and their papers from federal searches. So in that respect, at least, journalists are specifically treated differently under the law.
Is it because that's because it's so tied to the public interest? I know in many FOIA and in the PIA, it's if you are conducting research in the public interest or you're doing something that's not really for commercial gain kind of thing, then you can ask for your fees to be waived. It doesn't always work. It doesn't always help. But is it really the public interest that's kind of the tipping point there?
Yeah, I think this all comes down to to the public's benefit from the press and the public harms that result from attacks on the press. So think about why do we want journalists to have faster and more recoupable access to records? Because we count on journalists to identify news that needs reporting and then report it to the public. Why should journalists have additional protections from searches? Because we want journalists to be able to serve the public interest by gathering newsworthy information and reporting it, and we don't want sources to be afraid to talk to journalists for fear that their information is going to get swept up in a warrantless newsroom search. Why do we allow reporters to file motion? If you or I get a subpoena to testify in a case based on something that we've done in our, well, I guess I'm an attorney, so there's different things, right? But ordinary member
We
of the
hanging
public gets
out.
a
Okay.
subpoena to testify about something he knows. The understanding, the usual understanding, is that a jury or a grand jury is entitled to every man's testimony, but journalists under state law or common law or constitutional law or whether state or federal constitutional law get special protection precisely because we understand that if sources are afraid to talk to journalists because they're worried that the substance of their conversation is going to get turned over to the government or to a private party using a subpoena, they'll be less willing to talk. The journalist will have less information to report. The public will suffer from it or suffer as a result of it. So all of these things, all the sort of up and down the line. Why do we have Times v. Sullivan and the actual malice rule in public figure defamation cases? It's not because we don't like public figures. It's because we think that the democracy requires discussion and discourse. Discourse is harmed by chilling effects, by people being afraid to talk about public figures for fear that they will be sued for defamation. Um, why is that bad? Because if people are self-censoring, if people are chilling, then the public is going to be less informed about the people who are making decisions, people who might be up for election or appointments. So all of this comes down to the public's benefit at the end of the day.
And I think one of the things that one sometimes hears is like the idea no one is above the law. So, like, if we look at the Hannah Nathanson situation, I know you probably can't speak to specifics, but can you talk us through what avenues, if there's an investigation, why would going straight to a raid on a home bypasses all the other normal channels? Like could have gotten a warrant to look in the office. You could have um, gone a wide variety of ways to investigate. So, tell us a little bit about how that process would normally work that could preserve journalist protections, the public's right to know, and still make sure that, state secrets aren't being handed out willy-nilly kind of thing.
Sure. And so yeah, so again, without speaking to specifics about any particular cases, the journalists are a in one sense a ripe target for subpoenas or demands for information because reporters' job is to go gather information and to get people to talk to them. Um, and so if you were able to demand information and records from journalists, you would probably be able to gather information on especially because newsworthy topics include crimes, include criminal justice, include litigation between two parties. So if you just in an ordinary civil lawsuit, if you know that your opponent is talking to the press, wouldn't you want to know what they're saying?
Mhm.
So it's sort of understandable why litigants and the government might want to demand information from journalists. It's a ripe and low hanging fruit. Um, but the various protections that we recognize to keep journalists from being forced to hand over information um, may if they're functioning properly, they should make it harder rather than easier for a party seeking to demand information from a journalist to get it. So you could look in the context of a search, right? So the Privacy Protection Act, the federal law that I mentioned, was passed in response to a search of a newsroom, and in that sense, I would just point out I don't believe there's any distinction between whether it's the home of the journalist search or the physical newsroom. That is to say, it's about um, it's journalistic materials that are being
Mhm.
searched for and seized, frankly. So I think that you might know how can the government get information from someone? Well, they can ask for it, right? They can say, "Hi, we saw your report on this company that we are prosecuting for fraud. Would you mind sharing, the recording of your interview with the CEO with us? We'd really like to hear it because we think that he might have said something to you on tape that we could use to help prosecute him." And you could just ask. The journalist is probably going to say no.
Probably.
Um, the journalist might be willing to say, "Well, look, here's what I broadcast, right? Here's what's
Right,
on
here's the
tape.
reported
I'm
piece.
perfectly willing to sign an affidavit saying this is authentic," which is to say, like, yeah, this is, I was in this some that's called an authenticating affidavit. If you're planning to use this recording of my interview that is public in your prosecution, and you want me to just swear that this is an authentic copy of the interview, they might be willing to do that. No fuss, no muss. Um, but if you say no, what does the government do next? Well, there are sort of two options. If they think that you have information that could be evidence in a criminal investigation or an ongoing litigation, they can do one of two things. They could send you a subpoena, that is a legal demand for you to turn over the information, giving you a certain amount of time to respond, or they could get a search warrant from a court and execute that warrant on if they think you have an audio recording in your house of of an interview with the CEO, and they're going to get a warrant to come into your house and seize the tape. This is all complicated by the fact that we often all of us now store so much in the cloud that it's all this doesn't even consider the third possibility, which is that the government makes a demand to go directly to Google or Facebook or X or any other social media site or cloud storage site and just cuts you out of the process entirely and says, well, we're demanding this record, it's on your server, so give it to us. And you just sort of have to hope in a situation like that that the technology company is going to notify you that there's been a demand for your records, or that maybe you have contracted with the company in advance to make sure that they will give you advance warning so that you can object to a search. But all that is to say,
Just as a little tangent there, Max, like, is that starting to happen? Are you seeing that more and more? Because there's so much pressure on tech companies to, there's a lot of pressure right now. Have you started to see law enforcement going directly
so that
to global databases like that?
you can go back to the first Trump term when news broke that the Trump Department of Justice had issued demands for records. I believe it was from the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post. And I might be getting this wrong, it's been a few years, but I believe for the New York Times, there was, it was a demand through the third party that, that is, they demanded the records from a third party that had,
Hmm.
the New York Times's data stored, whereas I believe the Washington Post only had these records on its own server, and so the demand had to go to the Post itself. And so one of the fights that was about whether the internet service provider or the internet company could even inform the New York Times about this fight, and then whether it could object on the Times' behalf, whether it had to object on the Times' behalf. So, this is not a this is
It's not
not
esoteric.
this
This
is
is
not
like,
totally new,
yeah,
and it is already known that sort of one of the it's a convenience to store things in the cloud. You don't have to have your own servers, but it's a risk because if you have your own servers, then the demand has to come to you. It doesn't have to come. It doesn't go to a company that may or may not be able to um, make sure will inform you about a potential search and then give you an opportunity to object. But all that is to say that, I mean, one of the reasons why a search warrant is more imposing is because it is a demand. The government is going to show up and say, we have this. I mean, they have to get a judge to sign off on it, but all that process happens without any input from the target of the search, right? It's the government swears out an affidavit, prepares an application for a warrant, gives it to a magistrate judge. Um, all this is happening without the target of the search knowing about it, having an opportunity to object. So the target of the search finds out about it when the search is being executed. With a subpoena, you get served with a subpoena that says you have 30 days to provide us this tape of your conversation with the CEO. That's plenty of time for you to, for instance, go hire a lawyer, file a motion in court to quash the subpoena, say this is a violation of a reporter's privilege, a statutory or constitutional reporter's privilege, and put it to a judge to decide whether the subpoena is valid. So in Zurcher, what the Supreme Court said was, well, the First Amendment doesn't require there to be a subpoena first rather than a warrant. But it's probably better to go with a subpoena. It probably respects the delicate interests at play here. But we're not going to say that the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment require there to be um, a subpoena before resorting to a search warrant. In
hmm,
response to that decision, Congress passed the Privacy Protection Act, which said basically don't use warrants. Right? It was trying to sort of force that back onto the use subpoenas and said if you must demand records from journalists, use subpoenas instead. Now there are carved out exceptions to when you can still use a warrant, and whether those exceptions are satisfied here, I'm sure is a topic of discussion that I'm not going to get into today. But generally speaking, it's the purpose of the law is to try to push the government to use subpoenas instead of warrants. Um, and then what you had under the Biden DOJ was the Department of Justice had a series of guidelines to make it harder for federal prosecutors to issue those subpoenas, or at least to put a series of procedural safeguards in place so that if a assistant U.S. attorney wants to run off and ask a court to subpoena this, wants to fire off a subpoena to a journalist for their recording of the interview with the CEO, that they will need to get approval from the Attorney General of the United States or the Deputy Attorney General for the United States, right? And that there will be sufficient time, the subpoena will come out in sufficient time for you to object. These reporter guidelines were, great, and they resulted from a series of negotiations between the major news organizations, the Reporters Committee, and the Department of Justice. The problem with guidelines, of course, is that one Department of Justice, what one grants, the next one revokes, and so we have now seen under the second Trump administration, Department of Justice has revoked these guidelines or substantially drawn them back.
hmm.
So, um, the even the fact that it should be the case, the Privacy Protection Act pushes the government to subpoena instead of search warrant, and then DOJ guidelines are supposed to make it harder for those subpoenas to actually get issued, except in cases where, you know, the government can meet a pretty high burden and satisfy a bunch of procedural safeguards. Now the government is still getting pushed to use subpoenas, but now it's easier for the government to issue those subpoenas, and that again, it's going to chill sources. It's going to make journalists, take more precautions than they otherwise would in how they communicate with sources and maybe how and where they store their records. Um, that's just the and again, I'm sure the Department of Justice would say, well, we're going to prosecute more criminals, and this is a good thing. And how could you be against that? We're going to get more evidence and prosecute more criminals. Um,
So what
but,
is your argument? Because
I don't think they will cite any data for that assertion. But on the flip side, certainly is that there will be chilled speech as a result, and chilled speech hurts the public.
well, and I think, we fight this on the local level quite a bit and about like, oh, well, you're safer. We need to do this because of safety, because there are bad actors. But I think when we look at what we're losing, I mean, when you look at the erosions that we talked about, excuse me, defunding the public media so that there's less information out there, access to uh, places where reporters have customarily been allowed to go, such as the Pentagon, delays in FOIA, the diminishment of the press corps, stars and stripes being told unilaterally that you can't cover certain issues. I mean, I don't, safety is such a sort of, you, you're not really getting a lot of specifics on that, just to be like, oh, you're safe for now. Really? I'm not sure that we are, but are there uh, how do you normally combat that idea of, oh, we're doing this for your own good?
Sure. So I mean, look at the Pentagon press restrictions, which if you according to the Pentagon, are because they need to make the Pentagon more secure. They think journalists have been, I don't know, at least they imply that journalists have been wandering into secured areas, that they have been, improperly soliciting information from, military officials, and that, putting the national defense at risk. The facts don't bear that out. The press corps has responsibly reported from inside the Pentagon since 1948, I believe. I mean, like the press. There's a wonderful amicus brief that was just filed by the Pentagon Press Association, and my former colleague Dave Schultz, representing them, had talking about the history of reporters inside the Pentagon, how for decades the Pentagon has understood the importance of having the public's representatives in the form of the press be in there. I mean, incredible anecdotes about some of the reporting done inside the Pentagon, including on September 11th, while the fire was not yet out in the building. It was recognized as so important to the Pentagon and the press that a press conference that evening be held in the press briefing room. That the deputy press secretary or deputy undersecretary was physically helping the journalists who had evacuated across the road to move their equipment back in to the press. During COVID, even when public tours were canceled, press access was not curtailed. So,
Mhm.
the safety rationale, I think,
It feels
needs to
thin.
be taken with a real grain of salt. And the notion that the press is, I just don't think there's anything to back up the notion that the press is irresponsible with its reporting, that it puts people in danger. I think there's been much discussion recently about it. There are reports that some news organizations got wind of the military strikes in Venezuela early, didn't report on them, and leading to a discussion about, well, was that responsible? Was that not responsible? Why did they do that? Um, Journalists are responsible. Journalists think about the impact of their reporting, and so I think it's sort of it's a falsity to say, well, they're going to get access to information, they're going to report it willy nilly, people are going to be at risk. The other thing you're not taking into account is think about the stories that'll be harder to get, where stories of Pentagon waste, fraud, and abuse, stories about Afghanistan reconstruction being we litigated on behalf of the Washington Post a series of FOIA requests for records from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, showing that Craig Whitlock then turned into a book, the Afghanistan papers, talking about sort of what did the Pentagon know, when did they know it, about how ineffective America's efforts in reconstruction and rebuilding and fighting the drug war and fighting the Taliban were. Um, if you don't get that information out and you just have sort of an ineffective Pentagon program, and that that nobody wants to blow the whistle on because no one wants to admit that these efforts aren't working, that is also that's hurting the public in terms of public dollars are being spent ineffectively, lives are being put at risk for ineffective. So I think it's two sides of the coin, right? I don't think it's true that the press is reporting irresponsibly and that the press is reporting is putting people in danger. And I think it is true that if you cut the press off from these sources of information, they will be less able to report things that ultimately do promote public safety and financial responsibility and all the
Well,
things
and the
that
huge
we hope.
right that the press is there to, I think there's an oft reported Pew report on how incidents of corruption rise when news coverage goes down, and that's on a local and municipal level. But I think that certainly holds true in at the federal level as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Stars and Stripes issue is a little bit different because that is fully funded by the government, and I guess Voice of America also, as news programs being told what to cover and what not to cover, sort of where that how that diminishes access to information and what that means on the local level. I mean, you're asking service members to kind of just take on faith anything that's been told to them, and there's not an independent sort of analysis or reporting on some of the things that are affecting those people. And I just was curious what you were thinking about what happens when government says you can cover this but not that.
Sure. So I think with Stars and Stripes, and I'm not an expert on, and sort of the relationship between Stars and Stripes and the government is interesting. Um, my understanding, just as sort of a interested person of what is going on with Stars and Stripes now, is I believe what the government is trying to do is to rescind the regulation that says that Stars and Stripes should be treated should have editorial independence. That
Mm,
is to say, it may not be sort of technically independent of the government, but it should act as if editorially it is independent of the government. It should make decisions on what to publish and not what to publish based on its judgment of newsworthiness, not based on who whether technically DoD is the ultimate payer of the paychecks. Um, and yeah, I think I think that telling a news organization whose readership counts on them to stay informed on the news of the day, um, get rid of the protections that saying you're supposed to be editorial, you're supposed to use your editorial judgment. It hurts the news organization, right? Because all of a sudden you don't have this guidepost that says you're a journalist, be a journalist, and it hurts the readership because the thing about self-censorship that is so insidious is that you don't know what's not being reported, or you don't know how the story would have looked if if the reporter hadn't been looking over their shoulder or hadn't taken out a sentence for fear that they would get punished for it. And so it's it is the impact is you know you know it's happening. The impact is real, but it is very hard to say, well, this is a story that didn't get published because it is an impact of things that did not happen, stories that didn't get reported, quotes that didn't get published. And when you have journalists who are concerned that if they act with editorial independence, they make their best editorial judgment, that they might face some kind of retaliation as a result. Whether professional, if they work at Stars and Stripes, are they worried that they're going to get fired? If they are, a member of a press pool, are they worried that they're going to get ejected from the press pool? That fears of retaliation lead to self-censorship, and that self-censorship leads to a less informed public is the reason why the First Amendment protects against retaliation by the government. That is to say that this is not the retaliation isn't supposed to be allowed. precisely because courts for for generations have understood that in order to in order to stop the bad ends of a less informed public, you have to stop the bad means of retaliatory action against the press for their reporting.
So we've talked a little bit about the landscape at the federal level, but are you starting to see some of these impulses and sort of these actions kind of filter down to other jurisdictions, other areas? A couple years ago, we had that police raid in a Kansas newspaper. I'm not sure that that would have been um, something that would have been contemplated without some of these erosions, historic erosions that we've had that go back pretty far. But are you starting to see in your practice, or starting to see reporters' actions change, or maybe local governments stretching or overreaching, or taking their cues from this federal landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you're seeing it in both directions. So I would start with the upside, which is you are seeing states.
I was hoping we get to some good news.
Yeah, which is you're seeing states providing additional protections for journalists in the form of anti-SLAPP laws, of stronger reporter privileges. You've got momentum behind a federal behind a uniform anti-SLAPP law that is most recently enacted in Michigan. But so that that's on the move and on the rise. Um, you have states that are making it clear that there's a right to record. That there's sort of court by court and circuit by circuit, it's been recognized that the First Amendment protects the rights of citizens and journalists to record public officials carrying out, police officers on public streets, you know, uh, enforcing police powers. States are, some states are, making those protections clearer and stronger at a time when, in some parts of the country, the right to record is under attack.
Absolutely.
Um, so I don't want to say that it's all bad news, but sure, you are also seeing there are some states that, I mean, um, the raid on the Kansas newspaper was worrying. I have been following the story from somewhat afar. My understanding is that there have been rather significant there's been rather significant litigation since then. So at least that you know um, what worries me, for instance, is if you have newsroom searches being carried out by state officials. Normally, you might think, well, good thing we have a federal Department of Justice that has a civil rights division that can stand up for the First Amendment rights of citizens and journalists, even in states that are not doing a good enough job of protecting them. Now, right now, we're seeing the Civil Rights Division, reportedly is losing people left and right. So I think that is you can't detangle what's happening in the states from what's happening in the federal government, because I think we've long expected that the federal government would backstop.
Right. Well, and it's that patchwork of legislation where, across state lines, you're able to do one thing here and not another. You have this protection in this state and you don't in a neighboring state. And so that is, I you don't want to have situations where the public is kind of informed simply by where they live. And that happens sadly already because there are not as many news outlets in some areas of the country as others. But I think this exacerbates that trend for an uninformed populace. Would you agree, or am I off base on that?
No, I think you know challenge there are economic challenges to the press, and there are policy and governmental challenges to the press right now. And in some of those places, and in some places, they're working together to really uh, pinch the flow of news to the public. Um, and I, you know, it's hard to fight on one front, let alone two. So, I think news organizations are doing the best they can in really challenging times. Um, what that also means, though, economic pressures. We haven't even talked about libel lawsuits, right? Which are another thing that right now, you know, the president of the United States is a libel plaintiff in several lawsuits. Some of them my firm is working on that I'm not going to talk about, but he is suing many news organizations for defamation. Any, other government officials sort of following his example have also, I think, become emboldened as libel plaintiffs. So all of a sudden, you have lawsuits against the press um, that a generation ago no one would have considered, I think, filing. Every dollar that a news organization is spending on legal defense that it shouldn't have to spend, or on paying for lawyers to fight against a subpoena that it shouldn't have been issued in the first place, is a dollar that they're not spending on a journalist. It's certainly a dollar they're going to, in terms of what the priority is for newsroom spending is, are you going to fund that FOIA lawsuit that could potentially give, maybe that's going to get records loose that might lead to reporting in a year. I don't know. It's harder, when budgets are pinched, it makes investigative journalism harder. Some of that pinching is just market forces, but I think a lot of the pinching right now is the government, as investigator and government officials as libel plaintiffs. And it's that the public is the worst for it.
I think also when you're throttling information out there, there's so much. We're right now in the start of Maryland and Delaware's legislative session, and it's a lot of legislation around um, misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes, and so like when when there's not accurate news coverage out there, the public gets flooded with lots of other types of information. So, do you think that's is that, I hate to say it, is that a calculated strategy that you're seeing as government is sort of tightening up all this access, or is that just an unpleasant byproduct of what's happening?
I'd like to think it's just an unpleasant byproduct.
I
That
hope so.
that it is not an agenda to impoverish the public of information and then allow less reliable information to flourish in its place. Um, but it is something that I think as a consumer of the news, uh, it worries me as much as being a media lawyer, right? That um, if you sincerely believe, like, why is the First Amendment important? Why is the press important? It's because of its role in informing the public. Well, that means that, like, the public being misinformed is cause for concern. Now, I am also I think that the government attempts to label, what is disinformation, what is misinformation, raises its own set of concerns. So I don't want to sit here and say the government should be doing more you know, to censor fake news, because that puts a lot of trust in the government to decide what is fake news. Um, I do believe in the marketplace of ideas. I do believe that the on uh, the press will generally the best way to get to the truth is through a multitude of voices. Um, but sure, I mean, I think that I can't remember where I heard it, but there's sort of a maxim that the truth is paywalled and the lies are free is a tough reality to deal with right now. Um, and that's an economic reality. And I want to just to go back to where we started, like, why should we have public media in this country? Because I think everybody deserves a journalistically independent and high quality source of news. And what is PBS? But not in addition to providing great family, children, educational programming
Right? It's
that
not
I
just
have.
cozy murder mysteries. There are.
Exactly. But I'm an NPR listener. I'm a PBS viewer, and I think everybody deserves to be able to be an NPR listener and a PBS viewer if they want to be, if they want to get their news.
Well, I feel like this next period, you will not be at all sitting on your hands. I know there's a lot of work. A lot of this will be decided in the courts. I mean, aside from some of the challenges that are going back and forth, is there anything that you would recommend members of the public do in these situations? Is it, you know, we talk about contacting legislators, supporting local news, but if freedom of the press is important as a First Amendment right to people, w- what do you suggest is their best course of action?
Sure. Well, I think that, supporting at the state level laws that strengthen the press, not weaken the press. So state anti-SLAPP laws are good. State reporters' privilege laws are good. Um, I think it might be a while. We had a window where we might have seen a federal anti-SLAPP and a federal reporter's shield law. I think that window closed for now, but might
Mhm.
reopen again in the future. And I think we should be, you know, we as media advocates and members of the public who rely on the press should be willing to push when the window reopens for press protecting legislation. It can happen. Look at the Privacy Protection Act as an example. This it does
Not
happen.
just guidelines, but real
Exactly.
regulation.
Right. And then and then everybody sort of has to think about their what they're willing to spend on the news, their media diet, their media budget. I think I hope people can subscribe to a healthy mix of local, state, national news. I think it's great to some of us have the benefit. I think of the Washington Post being a greater DC resident. The Washington Post is both a national paper and my hometown paper, so you can sort of get both. Get your bang for your buck on both. But you might subscribe to the New York Times and to your local paper. And doing that, I think, benefits a healthy news ecosystem as well.
So being committed to being informed is probably sort of, and I think that is a critical piece. Because if you just sort of accept, oh, well, we'll let that slide by, or we won't inquire about that, or I'll just take that at face value. I mean, that is part of the problem. We want to have an informed public, and news media is certainly a big part of it. So thank you, Max, as always, for helping us navigate these thorny issues. You're always terrific to talk to, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your work on behalf of news media. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you today, and always a pleasure working with you.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.